Hello again. We're glad you're joining us on this study of the book of Daniel. Should be really good as we get into the text a little bit more. Last time we did an introduction, I think I said something like trying to keep it around 30 minutes. I looked at the time and it said 1 hour and 12 minutes as I brought it to a close. I thought, oh my, should have broken that up. Hey, hope you stuck with us so far. We still got a lot to cover, obviously. We're just now getting into the text. This is chapter 1. This is during the Babylonian era, and we're going to see that. Let's read chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. It was in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave, verse 2, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, verse 3, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them, verse 5, a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now, verse 6 says, among them were from the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then, verse 7, the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Okay, so obviously what's going on is Daniel and his buddies, at least the 3 of these that we have listed, have been taken captive into Babylon during the exile. And it says something like this in chapter 1 and verse 1. It was the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. The 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Now the skeptics have raised this sort of thing. They've said that this is kind of a contradiction, because in chapter 46 of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 46, it gives us a different year. It says this in Jeremiah chapter 46 and verse 2. It says, to Egypt, concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the Euphrates River at Carchemish, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. And the rest goes on to talk a little bit about that battle, the battle of Carchemish, where Babylon gets into it with Egypt. But this is, so it says in verse 2, it was the 4th year where Nebuchadnezzar defeats, it was the 4th year of Jehoiakim, in which Nebuchadnezzar makes this siege. So is it the 4th year, Jeremiah 46, verse 2, or is it as it says in Daniel 1:1, the 3rd year? Look, the best thing to do is recognize that we've got literature that's written from a very ancient time. And so, one of the things we need to see is that there were different methods used in order to calculate things. So, we have, on the one hand, we have Jeremiah, and his text is written in the Palestinian style. Then you've got Daniel, and Daniel writes in the Chaldean style. And so what they had in the Chaldeans arrangement was what was called the Ascension year. May have been a partial year. And they had that year that didn't actually get counted. It didn't actually get counted in their reign. So you had a year there where the king was finally taking the throne, but they didn't count it as the 1st year. So you had basically year 0, and then you had year 1, 2, 3. Whereas in the Palestinian calculation, they didn't have such a thing, and they just called it 1, 2, 3. There I go writing 4. 4, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. That's real bad, isn't it? So what we have is something like this. In Jeremiah's text, it could be the 4th year. Whereas in Daniel's text, it could be the 3rd year, given the Chaldean calculation. Most conservative scholars think that that's the most reasonable explanation. To find this as some big blatant contradiction is just nonsense, though. Read one lady scholar, Carol Newsom, who thinks that this is irreconcilable. You can't work this out, she says. That's just nonsense. And in fact, some of the more conservative scholars of yesteryear have easily pointed this thing out. I'd give E.J. Young and R.D. Wilson a good read before just concluding that it's irreconcilable. Let's get back into Daniel 1. We have this other difficulty in 1:1. It was the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, probably somewhere around 606, 605, depending on the calculation. 606 or 605 BC. And it says that King Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, the point is this. They say Nebuchadnezzar didn't take the throne until 604. Why is the text calling him King Nebuchadnezzar if this is the year about 606, 605 before he's actually crowned? Well, you got a couple of things. The first thing could be he could be a co-regent. He reigns beside his father. That's a high possibility. That's a high possibility. So a co-regency is something that's a phenomenon all over the Old Testament with the kings of Israel and of Judah, and it's not going to be something that we're foreign to by the end of our study of the book of Daniel. Surely looks like that's something that exists between Cyrus and Darius, a co-regency, where there were two kings on the throne, and one may have been something of a sub-king. Nebuchadnezzar easily could have been king in a sub kind of way, even in 606 BC to his father. So, this is a high possibility. Another possibility is this. The text of Daniel wasn't written in 606. So if Daniel writes this, let's say, 539 BC, how do you think Daniel thought of Nebuchadnezzar? King of Babylon? You know it. So maybe in 600, maybe in 550, maybe in 539, Daniel writing backwards about these events would just call him King of Babylon because that's who he was. He became that. If I were to say something like this, Drew Leonard, well, let's do it this way instead. Let's use a president. I don't even know where some of these folks were born, you see. But let's say Abraham Lincoln. Was he born in Kentucky or Illinois? I can't remember. Let's say Kentucky. Let's say if I said President Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. Well, you know that he wasn't president when he was born, right? I'm using this because that's who he became. That's who he was known as. The same thing's true of Nebuchadnezzar. To call this thing a big contradiction and to say that this reduces the whole thing to uninspired literature and it has human error in it, that is just nonsense as far as a view goes. We would give this kind of leniency to any other secular writer. It's odd to me that the skeptics don't give the Bible as much credit. We need to give the Bible the benefit of the doubt. It's just as credible as any other piece of secular literature, and as a Christian and as from an unbiased angle, I think we'd even need to go further than that and say that the Bible is even beyond the credibility of these other secular historians. The skeptics, the liberals, have it wrong when they start to doubt the text and they treat the secularists right. There is a major, major assumption that goes into that, and it's a grave error. The text has it right. It was the third year of Jehoiakim, and the text has it right. It was King Nebuchadnezzar. We need to allow the Bible to make these kinds of colloquialisms when it speaks. Well, it says this. He came up and besieged it, and it says in verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand. You know the Lord did that. The Lord gave Jehoiakim over into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. If God hadn't wanted Jehoiakim to be in Nebuchadnezzar's hand, he would have never given him over. This was God's decree. This was God's thing that had happened. And so it says that he took the vessels from the house of God, the temple that Solomon had built, brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, brought the vessels to the treasury. You can read the details in 2 Kings 24 and 25. 2 Kings 24 and 25. And then the king says that Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, verse 3, should bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. My translation has the word officials in 1:3. I've got a footnote that says maybe it means eunuchs. Now, this is interesting. You've got this word. Let me show you what it is. You've got this word saris or saris in the Hebrew, S-A-R-I-Y-S, saris, something like that. And the word means eunuch or official. Now, some of the individuals say that the word, saris doesn't mean castration. A good number of scholars say that the word saris doesn't mean castration. A good number of scholars on the other side of things say that it does. So who's to say? Don't quite know. I could tell you a number of scholars on both sides of the issue. But let's think about this for just a moment. Same word's used in Genesis 39. Same word is used in Genesis 39. where it's talking about Joseph and talks about the deal with Potiphar, calls Potiphar the Saurus. What if he were a eunuch and he's got this wife? Who's to say? Who's to say? If it implies castration, you've got something really interesting going on in Genesis 39. Maybe there's an indication as to why Joseph was even more sought after than typically recognized by Potiphar's wife. Tough to say, but Potiphar is either an official or a eunuch. If it implies castration, interesting. If it doesn't, well then maybe it just means official. Okay, then take a look at this in chapter 1 and verse 4. It says that these fellows, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's their Babylonian names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that is. Daniel's a Jewish name. But then they're Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. That's their Palestinian names. And these fellows, it says, were youths. Verse 4. Well, don't think that these were too young of fellows. The word in 1 Kings chapter 12 uses it all the way up to middle-aged men. So maybe they were a little bit older than perhaps we even recognized. I think teenagers. Maybe teenagers is probably the best way to go with this. They weren't babies, but at the same time, they weren't old men either. I think we get that from Daniel's text, especially as we reach the end of the book and see how old he had become by the end of it. Then in chapter 1, it talks about the Chaldeans. They were to be selected. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were to be selected for certain purposes. They were showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom. They were endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge. They were to have ability for serving in the king's court. They were to learn the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Make no mistake about it, this is indoctrination. And if they were to be made eunuchs rather than just officials, you get the idea. Their whole identity is being lost. They're losing their identity as males. They're losing their identity as national fellows. They're losing their identity by getting name changes. They're losing their identity with learning the literature of the Babylonians. Everything about Nebuchadnezzar's purpose here is to indoctrinate these fellows and turn them into Babylonians. That's basically what's trying to go here. That's what Nebuchadnezzar's trying to accomplish. So they're being indoctrinated, at least attempted to, that is, and they're losing identity. At least that's, again, what's trying to happen. And it didn't just happen with those things we just listed. It also happens with the food. The king's trying to give them of his food, the Babylonian food, and as we get into this in verse 8, it's going to look like that food is probably unlawful. Daniel makes up his mind he wouldn't defile himself with it. So maybe it was pagan food. Maybe it had been offered to pagan gods, that is. Could be something of the sort. Could be an unlawful kind of food or beverage. Could have been a food that was unlawful by the dietary laws of the Old Testament. Could have been alcoholic wine. Tough to say with any real certainty, but whatever it was, Daniel had determined he wasn't going to partake of it because it was unlawful before God. So in chapter 1, we have this reference to the Chaldeans. Chapter 1, verse 4, we have a reference to the Chaldeans. Well, who are the Chaldeans? The skeptics say that the word Chaldeans didn't come into use far later, and they say this indicates a later authorship of the book, like 2nd century late. Well, that's just false. Read Robert Dick Wilson on this. Read my commentary on it where I give a little bit of documentation. The word was used by Herodotus. It was used by a number of people even earlier than 2nd century, far earlier than 2nd century. 6th century is not by any means out of the question. So Chaldeans is a term that refers two ways. On the one hand, it refers to a Babylonian, a nationalistic remark. The second way Chaldean is used is to refer to specifically a group of wise men, the intellects per se. And it looks like that's how it's being used here. And like I said, while the skeptics want to doubt that that usage was used, there's evidence that suggests otherwise. So they're just simply, that's a no-go on that point. Then you get into chapter 1 and verse 5, and it says that they should be educated for 3 years. 3 years. Well, if you get into chapter 2 and in verse 1, it's going to say it was the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, with the Babylonians and the Ascension year, that could be in chapter 2, verse 1, that could be about, I'd say probably about 603. Something like that. Tough to say, maybe even 602. So we have a couple of different options. Let me draw this out for us, just so we see what I'm saying is a problem. In chapter 1, it's the 3rd year of Jehoiakim where the invasion takes place. That'd be something like 606, don't you think? Daniel 1. 1. Now, if Daniel is using the Chaldean, Babylonian calculation, you see what I'm saying there? It could be 606 is probably good as being the third year of Jehoiakim, where Jehoiakim actually is in 609, but he calculates it out as 608, then 607, then 606. Probably something like that. So then for 3 years, it says they were in this testing period. That's what 1:5 says. Appointed that they should be educated 3 years. We're going to think probably somewhere around 603, right? Somewhere around there. Maybe it depends on how you count the 3 years. Maybe it could even be 604. Maybe it could even be 602. But 603 is, let's just put that as a question for the moment. 603 per 1:5. That's where we would expect the 3 years to end. I'd say something like that. When you get to 2 verse 1, when you get to Daniel 2:1, it says it was the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. It looks clear enough to me that in 604, we have Nebuchadnezzar's beginning of his reign. 604. Well, if we use the Babylonian calculation, we wouldn't count 604 as a year. So the first year would be 603, and the second year would be 602. Maybe that's the year in view in 2:1. Now here's my point. This wouldn't overlap. If that's true, if we use the Babylonian method of counting, which certainly looks like is good here, that makes sense of chapter 1. That's now going to make sense of chapter 2. We have this 3-year period of testing from 606 rather, into 603. That would be the 3 years from 1:1 to 1:5, 3 years. And then we have at least a period of time, perhaps, until 602, which would be talked about in 2:1, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know if that makes sense. Get the commentary, give it a read. Give this segment another watch, perhaps. That makes sense to me. So we have a couple of different possibilities as to why Daniel has 3 years and how that interacts with chapter 2. It looks like to me there is a break here, but it could even be possible that this 3 years of testing runs into chapter 2. It could be that we're not supposed to count full years in some of these cases. The Babylonian method helps us. All of that makes sense. I don't know if you're understanding why I'm making this a big thing, but the skeptics really try to make a big deal out of the chronology. It looks clear enough to me that we've got numbers of solutions here. Let's give Daniel the benefit of the doubt again, and let's just see that he's in the ancient time. He is right there at the moment. His authorship, it shouldn't be questioned, really, and it looks to me like he's probably got it right. Okay, let's look at 6 and 7. Then they get these new names. This was a practice even in Old Testament Egypt, wasn't it? In Genesis chapter 41, Joseph gets a new name. And then there's God's purpose of giving people new names. Jacob is changed to Israel. Isaiah 62 uses it in a prophetic way. Revelation 2 and 3 uses it in a new way. The idea of a new name maybe says something about new identity, and that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar's trying to do here. He's trying to give these fellows a new identity, an anti-God identity. And in Daniel chapter 1, he's trying to indoctrinate them. That's what's going on. That's the situation. Loss of identity is in question. Now enters Daniel and his perspective. This is chapter 1 and verse 8. Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. We'll read through 16. And it says in verse 13, Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days, verse 14 says. Verse 15 says, at the end of 10 days their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. And the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Let's work with this for just a moment. The food, like I said earlier, could have been pagan, could have been an unlawful food according to the dietary laws of the Old Testament. It could have been alcoholic wine. It's tough to say with any real certainty, but whatever the case was, Daniel had made up his mind not to engage in it. We need to make up our minds not to get involved in the muck and the mire that's spat out by the world. And that's the kind of fellow Daniel and his three buddies were. They were the kind of people who said, we're going to serve God. They'd already made up their minds. Folks, you need to make up your minds to serve God before you get into the crisis. If you have already questioned whether or not in the way that you're doubting, you're skeptical about your own abilities to take on the crisis, it's almost as if you're setting yourself up to fail. You need to go ahead and determine you're going to do what God says. And if you do fail, then try to get back on the horse and do what's right. But don't go ahead and be skeptical about your own abilities in the face of the devil. He's trying to tempt you. You know he's going to try to tempt you. Determined to do what's right and do your best at it. Ezra did the same sort of thing in chapter 7, verse 10. He prepared his heart to seek God, his statutes, his judgments. And so we have Daniel doing the same sort of thing. Josephus says here that it was probably about health. That's questionable. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, but Josephus did have that to say. Take a look then at 12. Take a look then at verse 12. The 10 days is mentioned in verse 12. 10 days. He says, test us 10 days. In verse 14, listen to this matter, 10 days. Verse 15, the end of 10 days, they already appeared better, and the Hebrew is probably healthier. Fatter is a weird word to use there in our English understanding. Probably means something like healthy. Perfectly adequate translation. So he's got 10 days of testing. Why 10 days? I'm not quite sure, but it's a good enough period for where God can intervene. And the text doesn't say God did that, but if we don't see God's hand in all of this, I think we're missing something entirely. God's hand is involved in showing that these youths can be successful without Babylonian influence. Folks, you can be successful without Babylonian influence. Do you know what I mean by that? Do you know that you can be a successful, purposeful, accomplished human being without the approval of the world? Did you know you don't need to be an elitist? Did you know you don't need to be a snob in order to be a person that has purpose and is really something in this world? God has already made Daniel a great man. Later on, it's going to say in the text that Nebuchadnezzar made Daniel a great man. Well, he only in as far as Nebuchadnezzar thought. Daniel was already a great man without Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't he? And so are you. But you've got to determine to be God's man, and you don't need the Babylonians to tell you that you're something. And so 10 days are given, and later on, it seems to me in Revelation 2, the writer there echoes this text about the 10 days and says, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Why do you think that the author of Revelation, John the Apostle, why do you think that he drew on Daniel 1, the 10 days, in order to tell the people, be faithful? It reminded them that God was with Daniel, and so he'd also be with them. 10 days is not an accidental echo of Revelation 2:10. Revelation 2:10 is purposefully echoing Daniel chapter 1 to say that God has had periods of testing before, and he carries his people through. You might have 10 days coming up in your future. You going to stand with God, or are you going to cave to the pressure? Folks, determine like Daniel to stand for God. Okay, let's get into the last little section here, and we'll bring this whole segment to a close. This is 117. 117. As for these four youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And in our last segment, we read those texts from Ezekiel 14:14, Ezekiel 14:20, and Ezekiel 28:3, where Daniel had been given a certain amount of wisdom and interpretation from God. Now catch this. If God can do that sort of thing, you know he can interact in the 10 days of the period of testing. So, God makes Daniel some kind of exceptional fellow in wisdom and interpretation of dreams and in intelligence and literature. This is verse 18. And it says, and at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the king had 3 years. That's what he said in 1:5. 3 years he was going to give them to learn all of this. But maybe this was the 10 days the king had specified for presenting them. I don't know. It's tough to say. But it says this in verse 18, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. Probably the 3 years, I'd think. And so it says, at the end of the days, Daniel stood before King Nebuchadnezzar. Not an accident. 12:13 uses the same kind of remark. This is Daniel 12 and 13, where he doesn't stand before King Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel 12:13, he knows before he dies, there's coming a day where he'll stand before the King, Jehovah God. And so in 12:13 it says, Daniel, go your way to the end, then you'll enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age, the end of the days. He's talking about there where he's going to stand. His prophetic corpus will stand before the King, Jehovah God, and he'll be vindicated. So here he is in Daniel chapter 1 before King Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar's nobody real. I mean, God's the one who really is of importance. And so it says in 1:18, Daniel stood before the king. Well, what happens in 19? Daniel 1:19, the king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Isn't that something? So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, verse 20, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And it says, and Daniel continued into the first year of Cyrus the king, until the first year of Cyrus the king. Let's spend just a moment here and we'll bring all this to a close. In chapter 1, do you see that the life with Christ, I mean, I know that the Messiah hasn't come yet as far as Daniel's concerned, but don't you see that life with Christ is far better than life with the world? And that's not hardly a point that's argued here explicitly. But isn't it something that the world tricks us? The deceiver lies to us, and he gets us to buy into the idea that we're nothing unless the world gives us its approval. And here's Daniel and his 3 buddies, and what are they doing? They're actually excelling beyond that of the naturalists, the pagans. And here we bought into a lie sometimes where we think that we really need approval from others in order to make sure that we are something. Folks, you can't overestimate the impact that life with Christ offers. It makes us into better people. It makes us experience a full life. And that's not just some trite one-liner. That's not just something we say. That's something we believe in. And we believe in it because the Bible teaches it. And not only because of that, but because it's real. You spend time with God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit, and you spend it in His Word. You spend it in prayer. You develop a relationship with His people and with the fellowship of the saints. You might start to find out that there really is something about that offers a more wholesome life. But to the people who will never try it, it's tough to explain. Daniel and these boys are living in the worst of situations, wouldn't you think? And here's God seeing to it that He'll help them excel. Maybe God will help you excel as well. Then we've got this remark, a little tricky remark here at the end in 121. It says, Daniel continued into the first year of Cyrus the king. Now the skeptics have had a fit with this because in Daniel chapters 9 and 10, it puts him into the 3rd year of Cyrus. Daniel chapter 10, Daniel chapter 9 puts him into the 3rd year of Cyrus. This is specifically Daniel chapter 10. And it says in verse 1, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel. And they scream again, contradiction, contradiction, contradiction. This is not good. Well, in Daniel 1:21, I suppose it'd be a contradiction if the purpose of the remark were to say that Daniel died at Cyrus's first year, but that's not what the text says. In fact, we've got about 4 different reasons, I think, as to why it says in 121 that he continued unto the 1st year, until the 1st year of Cyrus. The first thing is this. It says to us that Daniel lives into the next world empire. It's not telling us that he died in the 3rd year, the 1st year, the 5th year, the 1st year again. It doesn't tell us that sort of thing. The remark just lets us know. The remark is preparatory. Daniel's going to live through the entire Babylonian exile and into the reign of the Medes and the Persians. The second thing it tells us is it tells us that Daniel lives through the exile. So he lives into the next empire. He lives through the exile. A third thing is that it tells us that both texts are true. I mean, there's nothing propositionally wrong with saying Daniel lived until the 1st year of Cyrus. And then another case saying Daniel lived in the 3rd year of Cyrus. Propositionally, both of those statements are true. Could be true at the least. And so what we have in 121 is not a remark we're saying he died here. It's just simply saying that he lived until the next regime. And then the fourth point is this, and that is it prepares us for 9-1 and the 70 weeks. In Daniel chapter 9, we're going to have this extraordinary prophetic text, the 70 weeks. And in Daniel chapter 9:1, it says it was the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. It's letting us know that Daniel is qualified to live into that next regime and even tell us about this other prophetic text. It's preparing us to see Cyrus and that time, as Daniel will even be the author of that later text, which takes up about 9 through 12. It's about 4 chapters long. He gives us a short prophecy in 9:24 through 27, and chapters 10 through 12 are the expanded view of that. They both talk about the same thing, run to the same limit, but Daniel 10 through 12 is an expanded view of what 9:24 through 27 offers. Daniel chapter 1 prepares us to see Daniel as the same prophet, even at that later time, who will give us those magnificent prophetic texts at the latter end of the book. This brings us to the end of Daniel chapter 1. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you've got other questions or concerns, you can always email me at drewleonard@live.com. But there's also this commentary here. Oh, it's about, let's check. I think it's about 280 pages. 276 pages. And it offers a lot more detail than maybe even what I've done here in the video. It offers a lot of detail even in the introduction and in the commentary in a number of places. You might enjoy having it in your library. You can find it on lulu.com, Lulu.com, and you can also find it through my website, which will just refer you. It will give you a link to the publisher where you can make the purchase there. If you're interested in anything else about Daniel, shoot me an email. Just reach out, take a look at the book, and hopefully you'll make the most of your study of the book of Daniel. Until next time, may God bless you always richly to his glory.